Hey guys, this is Dave with Audio In, and I have the Mars T5S, which is 10 Hi-Fi's newest single dynamic driver IEM. Of course, this is the follow-up to the T5. I haven't listened to the T5, so I couldn't really do any comparisons between the two. However, I have done pretty extensive comparisons with several of my other favorite IEMs in this price range. So as usual, we'll go over the contents of the package, we'll talk about the design and the specifications, do a fairly deep dive into the sound, and then we'll get into some comparisons towards the end. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Included in the box is the IEMs and cable. They also provide a nice case. It's kind of unique too. A decent selection of ear tips, some extra filters, and then finally we have a pair of tweezers and then a cleaning brush. Now, as far as the price, specifications, and design, the T5S comes in at $129 and it has a single dynamic driver configuration. The driver is housed in an all aluminum alloy shell, which seems to be fairly well constructed. It also fits my ears just fine. I can get pretty good insertion depth, and using the included ear tips, I achieved a really good seal. It also provides good levels of comfort and isolation. But even more importantly, during longer listening sessions, I was able to maintain that seal without having to mess with it or adjust it constantly. And I was also able to maintain those good comfort levels for that long period of time. So I had no problem just listening for about 3 hours while I was on a flight. So that was really cool. The cable is also pretty good. It's a 2-pin cable and has a 3.5 termination. It is just a little plasticky feeling to the touch, but I don't really have a problem with that because it's otherwise very soft, easy enough to roll up and easy to store, easy to manage. And I didn't really have very many issues as far as tangling at all. And it also seems to be well constructed, which at this price point are the things I'm more concerned about anyway. Now, as far as the design of the IEM, it's fine. There isn't really much to it. They've definitely taken a more minimalist approach aesthetically. I do like it, but the most important thing is, again, in my opinion, is that at this price point, its construction, its comfort level, its manageability, it's decently accessorized, which it does check all of those boxes. But the big question, of course, is how does it sound? Well, let's talk about that. Okay, let's talk about the sound of the T5S. I'll start with its overall presentation and then I'll break it down further and go into more detail. But as usual, I'll talk about where I feel the T5S stands in terms of its value and performance when compared to some of the competition. So the overall sound signature of the T5S is neutral, which is nice because at this price point, it seems like you typically see a more V-shape approach, and we all know that common issues with V-shape tuned IEMs can be thinness and unnaturalness with instrument and vocal presentation. And while I wouldn't necessarily say the T5S is a very natural set, I would say it's more natural sounding than, again, what you typically see at this price point. And it does do a pretty good job at avoiding sounding overly thinned. And also, just to remind you, my preference as far as tuning is neutral with the bass boost. Now, if we break it down though, starting with the bass, as far as the bass quantity, as neutral tunings go, I would say this is more bass than what you would typically see in a neutrally tuned IM. So it does have a little bit of a bass boost. Actually, probably more sub bass because this is a more sub bass focused tuning, which is great because it's going to give you really good extension, nice amounts of sub bass rumble. And then as you move into the bass and mid bass, it does start to decrease. Not that there isn't enough mid bass, it's just that, again, the focus is on the sub bass. I do think there is plenty of mid bass presence, and that does allow for kick drums to have good punch and slam. As a matter of fact, dynamics are great with this set. And even though this is a dynamic driver set, and I do expect that from a dynamic driver, this set probably has one of the better dynamic driver implementations that I've seen, at least in terms, again, of bass reproduction within this price range. It's not the most controlled bass as far as how they handled the transition into the lower mids, and there is definitely some bass bleed, but again, for this price range, I think they did a really, really good job overall. And then as you move a little further up into the lower mids and mids, there is a little bit of warmth in the way that it presents male vocals and instruments that land within that area. It's also not going to give you a ton of detail, although it does do a good job at keeping things sounding pretty natural, which again, is good for this price point. The mids are a little recessed at about 600 hertz, but then the upper mid-range energy kicks right back up, and it does have a fairly smooth rise into the Pina gain around 2.5K. And then it kind of plateaus, and it keeps that same energy all the way until around 4.5K, and then it drops off again. So what this does, at least based on what I'm hearing, is it presents instruments and most vocals with more of a smoothness, and that's a good thing. Now, they may not be as forward as what you might typically get with a more traditional neutral tuning, but that upper mid-range energy is still there, and I do feel like it's enough to keep vocals and instruments from getting overwhelmed, so they still maintain enough of a good center image and keep the listener's attention and focus as they should. And again, all while still maintaining an overall natural presentation. And then moving a little further up into the treble and upper treble, this is where I wish they had given the T5S maybe a little more attention because it's a little too smooth or safe for me. And it reminds me a little of how the Galileo made me feel as far as wanting just a little more treble energy. Now, I should also point out that the Galileo has been and is still one of my all-time favorite sets at the $100 price point. In any case, up to this point, I must say the T5S really has impressed me in almost every other regard. So I do wish it had more upper treble energy. But that being said, there is enough treble energy to allow some of the higher frequency instruments to come through and be heard. They're just pushed back a little further in the mix. And while I also do think the treble detail is adequate for this price point, it's not the best I've heard. And of course, the treble roll-off does negatively impact the amount of air and shimmer as well. Now, as far as technicalities, the soundstage is about average for an IEM, which is fine. It doesn't quite have as much forward depth as I would typically like to see. Not that it's a wall of sound necessarily, but it is a little more of a flatter presentation. Instrument separation and imaging is decent. It's not super focused, but it's good enough to be able to place the instruments kind of within their sound field. Again, detail levels, as I'd mentioned earlier, are just okay, and that could be, I think, attributable maybe to the way they approach the treble tuning. So then where does that put the T5S in terms of value, and how does it stack up in terms of the competition? Well, the most technical set that I have at this price point is the F1 Pro, and the T5S definitely does not compete on a technical level with the F1 Pro, but it is tuned better than the F1 Pro as far as its ability to present instruments more naturally. And to be honest, I would prefer more natural presentation over technical performance anyway, but that's just me. Now, I should also point out that as far as V-shaped tuned budget sets go, the F1 Pro is probably my favorite, but again, I'm more likely to reach for a neutral and natural set like the T5S most of the time. But here's the thing, at the end of the day, I still personally don't think the T5S can compete with some of my other favorite budget sets like the Kima Classic, the Galileo, Aria 2. The Galileo is tuned a little better, and it still gives me a slightly more natural presentation overall. The Aria 2, the Kima Classic are also tuned just a little better, and they bring a little more treble and upper treble energy to the table that the T5S is missing, and a little more detail and micro nuances as well. And another thing is also, again, this set to me is just a little too safe. I do think the T5S comes very close to the Galileo as far as its naturalness, which is saying a lot. As a matter of fact, if they had just added a little more treble energy, who knows? It may have pushed it over the edge and maybe even pushed it into my top 3. And again, I should remind you, the T5S's bass is probably the best I've heard at this price point. So this set really does do a lot of things well for it being a budget set. So that concludes my review of the 10 Hi-Fi Mars T5S. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, please share this video. I hope you guys have an awesome day.